This unit is all about mostly about pruning and the different techniques that are there. And obviously in the picture that we can see here, the worst thing that can happen when you're pruning isn't whether you can damage the plants or whether you can affect the health of the plants, but the biggest thing that you can damage is of course your ego. And as we can see here in this picture here, the lady is out pruning the roses and she's cutting all the flowers off his roses, and he's not very happy. So the worst damage that can happen from pruning is when you're taking off a heavy lateral growth, and that's when it takes all of the bark all the way down to the root or the base of a tree. This is usually seen on trees or very large shrubs. But damaged material can be there in all sorts of ways. Damaged material through wind or through heavy snow that has laid on branches. Diseased growth that has become really weak and has broken. But damage is normally a physical thing that we talk about. It's not something that's living in there like a disease or a pest. Eventually what the results of what a pest does creates damaged growth. So it's normally secondary to something. So as we can see here in this picture, we have a picture of a tree that has been damaged either by lightning or by wind, heavy wind and storms. To remove a heavy lateral branch, the one that may become damaged or dead, it's really important that you do it so you don't end up damaging the plant. So the first thing that needs to happen is an undercut, and that's normally done quite a bit further along away from where you want your final cut to be. So if you wanted to cut there, you would need to move it further along to do your undercut, and you need to go at least a third or if not halfway through. But the general rule of thumb is if you're sawing and you really can't get through any further because that cut creates friction on the saw, that's as far as you can go, then that's the time to stop, and you know you've done enough of an undercut. And what you're doing is you're creating a stopper or a breaker so that when you cut through it, do your top cut, at this point here where you can see this undercut, that is where the bark will stop and won't tear down and go all the way down to the bottom of the tree, and it could eventually damage it or even kill the tree. So the next cut that happens is the one that happens here. It's a top cut. Normally it's about a thumb's length away from your undercut, away from where you want to be cutting. So that's about 5 centimeters or 2 inches, and you do your top cut and you cut and cut and cut and cut until something happens and the branch breaks. And what you can see has happened here is the undercut here has stopped the bark from carrying along and doing a tear, and that's when you come in and do your final cut, which is a sloping cut, ideally to a growth point or to a collar branch, so that you don't get a load of dieback, because all of this could end up dying back, and then that attracts pests and diseases and it becomes damaged growth. So this is a way of preventing damaged growth when you're taking away a very heavy lateral branch. Another form of damage that you'll see a lot through the winter and even through the spring, especially on herbaceous or soft growth, is where frost damage has occurred. And basically what happens is plants are a big percentage of them is water. Water, when it freezes, it expands by about 25%, which means that all of the cells that are within the plant, they expand or burst, and this causes like a bruising or a black sort of sludge that forms because it kills off the cells, they've ruptured, and basically that's what causes frost damage. Very often it can be seen as also as being like a burn or a black mark that you see. But two of the worst causes of frost damage are a slight wind or breeze with a wind chill factor, and obviously temperatures that go below 0 degrees centigrade. And the more you go into the minuses, the more damage that can occur. Or in the springtime, the issue is when you get a load of soft growth that comes up and then suddenly you get a late frost. That can do a lot of damage as well. That creates frost damage. Worst damage that can happen from pruning is when you're taking off a heavy lateral growth, and that's when it takes all of the bark all the way down to the root or the base of a tree. This is usually seen on trees or very large shrubs. But damaged material can be there in all sorts of ways. Damaged material through wind or through heavy snow that has laid on branches. diseased growth that has become really weak and has broken. But damage is normally a physical thing that we talk about. It's not something that's living in there like a disease or a pest. Eventually, what the results of what a pest does creates damaged growth. So it's normally secondary to something. So as we can see here in this picture, we have a picture of a tree that has been damaged either by lightning or by wind, heavy wind and storms. Wind damage, obviously we saw the wind damage on that tree where it had taken a branch down, but also wind can cause a type of scorching. Wind has a habit of magnifying temperatures. So in really hot conditions, it can magnify the temperature, and really cold conditions, you can get a wind chill factor that magnifies how cold it is. So it has the effect of either drying out or freezing very quickly. Damaged plant, this can happen through excessive pruning. So you can see on certain plants that are evergreen, particularly with conifers such as the Lelandii, if you prune them too far back beyond the green, very often they won't forgive you. So watch how far you take stuff back, that you don't go beyond the green growth that is already on the outside edge. There is disease material, so this is when it becomes a living problem. So you've got some sort of mildew that's occurred on the plants, or you've got a fungus that has come in. This is a living problem that can end up damaging the plant. We also have black spot, that's another classic one that we see, which is a disease that is a fungal problem. Canker is another one, that's a bacterial problem. And also the other types of material that we don't want are weeds. Now, these are the worst of the weeds that you can see, and in other units you've had to identify these weeds. A weed is defined as a plant that's in the wrong place, and this tended to be the case where by a lot of people, like on the television, were saying, yeah, our plant is in the wrong place. But I would argue the point, if you brought a rhododendron that was really expensive and you planted it in the wrong place, you still would not class it as a weed. So there are other things that come around it. So it might be native or wild, so it's grown without being planted. But again, if you go into a meadow, a native or wild plant isn't a weed, it's a plant that's valued. Again, it's a plant that you've not planted, it's invasive, and it damages as a plant. So all of those things, those are questions that you need to ask to know whether it's a weed or not. There is disease material, so this is when it becomes a living problem. So you've got some sort of mildew that's occurred on the plants, or you've got a fungus that has come in. This is a living problem that can end up damaging the plant. We also have black spot, that's another classic one that we see, which is a disease that is a fungal problem. So we can see here the Elaeagnus pungens maculata has a similar thing. The reversion has occurred, so you can see the variegated growth. It's nice yellow and green, and then the reverted growth, which is just plain green, which is not why we wanted the plant. We wanted it because it looked nice and yellow and interesting, and if you're a florist, it has interest to it, where the green stuff's boring. So prune it out very carefully. Then we have looking at dead and living growth, looking at the difference between it, and the key is just scratching below the surface. This is particularly on woody growth, so we can see under the dead growth that's there, just below the surface it's brown, whereas on living growth just below the surface it's nice and green. Trees covered in a sleeve of green life where the sap moves through. This stuff that's in the middle is structural, non-living growth. the stuff on the outside is the green growth where all the sap's going. It's just below the bark. If that's green, it's living. But again, look at the buds. If it's nice green, swelled up, healthy bud, you know it's alive. But if it's, and this is particularly in winter time that we struggle to know whether something's alive. But if it's brown, looking a bit shriveled, the bud there, then it is dead. This unit is all about mostly about pruning and the different techniques that are there. And obviously in the picture that we can see here, the worst thing that can happen when you're pruning isn't whether you can damage the plants or whether you can affect the health of the plants, but the biggest thing that you can damage is of course your ego. And as we can see here in this picture here, the lady is out pruning the roses and she's cutting all the flowers off his roses, and he's not very happy. So you can see on this conifer hedge that it's got too tall, the garden's too dark, it's not letting enough light in, so it needs to be cut down and the sides need to be trimmed up to allow more light in, and it needs to have a nice level top. So that's another form of excessive growth that you see very often on hedges. And again, that's ridiculous, isn't it? You can see that that conifer hedge has just taken up the entire house. It's swallowed it up. That is a real extreme look at what excessive growth, and you can see the cables are trying to get through it, so it's really actually to the point where it's quite dangerous. There's probably no dark, that house is really dark, people can't see it, whatever, lights on all the time, and it's probably affecting the structure of the building. So excessive growth needs to be removed as soon as possible on that one, as we can see. There is disease material, so this is when it becomes a living problem. So you've got some sort of mildew that's occurred on the plants, or you've got a fungus that has come in. This is a living problem that can end up damaging the plant. So here are some plant maintenance procedures. So these are your general pruning procedures that we have here. So the classic one is pollarding, and that's where you don't cut it down to the ground, but you cut it to last year's cut. So you can see that chap there is cutting a buddleia down, and what he's doing is cutting it back to the growth that is on that. He's cutting it back this year's growth, so he's cutting it back to last year's cuts, and you get more and more stems come out. And on buddleia in particular, it only flowers on this year's growth. So what it means is that when it puts on a good meters of growth, by the end of the season, that new growth will then be covered in flowers. So it encourages lots and lots more flowers. So you can do it with buddleia and sambucus and plants like that. And pollarding is cutting really hard back, but still leaving quite a bit above the ground. Another one is coppicing. This is ancient England. An ancient tradition in England. That's where you cut everything right the way down to the ground, and you do this with willows and dogwoods and hazels. It's for getting really good building material. But with your coloured stemmed willows and dogwoods, it helps create a flush of new growth, which is beautiful and colourful through the winter. And you do this in March, particularly for the coloured stem stuff, because if you did it sort of through November or December, you're cutting off all that beautiful coloured foliage or branches, which would look really nice in the winter. So it's cutting it back hard, ideally to a node or a growth point. The pruning of rhododendrons and roses. One of the regular pruning techniques is deadheading. Obviously roses is a different thing, we'll cover that in another subject. But yeah, take removal of the dead flowers, that keeps the plant in a nice shape, and it also helps it to produce more flowers, so it encourages more flowers. Particularly with roses, within that season, if you keep deadheading, particularly with bedding plants as well, if you keep deadheading, the plant thinks, oh, I've got to produce more flowers, I've got to produce more seed. We've lost the flowers before they turn to seed, then you'll get another flush of flowers. So here's how to prune some bamboo. So this one's called thinning. So that's where You take out the really long stems, cut them right the way down to the ground, and you leave the next newer stems for the next year. It's kind of like a regeneration, and you can do that with a lot of fruit trees and even raspberry canes as well. So that's thinning. And then another technique is crown thinning. We spoke a little bit about this. So that's where you've got a tree that's got lots and lots of branches in the crown, and what we do is we go through and thin it. So you take out all of that stuff that is right in the middle, so that you open it out, and what it's doing then is it's creating nice air movement through the tree, and it's stopping the build-up of pests and diseases in there, and it's also encouraging light, and this will particularly help with producing fruit on apple trees. The next one is looking at trimming a hedge. We spoke a little bit about this before, and the most important thing about a hedge is the angle of the sides. So what's really important is that it slopes down, because what happens if it doesn't, it creates a shadow at the bottom of the hedge. So if you've got that nice sloping edge, the light can get down nice and evenly. And there's different ways of making sure you get it nice and flat, using a string to run across the top. So here's a bit more of an explanation of how the correct shape works. And it also works with the snow as well. If the snow settles on the hedge, it doesn't build up on the top, it goes off. Whereas if you've got a flat top, the snow sits on there and it can end up breaking the hedge and ruining it. So that's your issue with the rectangle. The A shape is the best way to prune a hedge if you're looking from the hedge from the side on. So these are your formal hedges, topiarized, and then we've got informal hedges that might be lavender or potentilla. They tend to be fairly low, and it's just a matter of just pruning off the flowers, or pruning it in a cloud-like way, having sort of lots of informal shapes, but still creating it as a barrier that runs through the border. Wildlife habitats, you need to consider how to prune those, layering them the correct way, but also trimming them. Again, you need the A shape, which works really well, and it's also think about the time of year that you do it. Don't do it when the birds are laying eggs or nesting. And there's some more hedges that are a lot more informal in the countryside. Some of them are coppices or pollarded hedges. So you can see that hedging is a really big thing, it's a really big subject. And these are 4 of the best native hedges that you can mix together. And obviously pruning these in an informal way, but still keeping that angled, that A shape, helps them to get most of the light. And as you can see, a lot of these have really small leaves, and that's the key for a hedge. When you prune something with smaller leaves, you tend to get a nicer, better shape. So these are your formal hedges, topiarized. Thinning might be seen in the perennial border, not just with woody stuff. So that might be lifting and dividing plants that have got too big, that have spread too much. And another procedure for maintenance is irrigation. So it's making sure that plants get plenty of water. There's lots of different forms of irrigation, but generally speaking, it tends to be automatic or en masse. So you might have a sprinkler irrigation, or you might have an individual drip feed that drips on individual plants. The sprinkler is dead easy to set up. The drip one takes a lot of work, but it saves a lot of water and gives you really nice healthy plants. This unit is all about mostly about pruning and the different techniques that are there. And obviously in the picture that we can see here, the worst thing that can happen when you're pruning isn't whether you can damage the plants or whether you can affect the health of the plants, but the biggest thing that you can damage is of course your ego. And as we can see here in this picture here, the lady is out pruning the roses and she's cutting all the flowers off his roses, and he's not very happy. So the And then shade is another thing. You can use shade from other plants, or in a fruit cage you can use shade that also keeps off butterflies and it keeps out the birds from eating stuff. You can either make a structure to put the shading over, or if it's small stuff, herbaceous stuff, you can use shade just straight down over a crop for temporarily. Shade also helps to keep away the frost. It can be as effective as polythene on a greenhouse or greenhouse glass. So don't forget, shade can also help reduce the harshness of temperatures, not just at the point of really harsh sunlight that is hot, but also really cold temperatures as well. So you can see on this conifer hedge that it's got too tall, the garden's too dark, it's not letting enough light in, so it needs to be cut down and the sides need to be trimmed up to allow more light in, and it needs to have a nice level top. So that's another form of excessive growth that you see very often on hedges. And also protection. Providing protection for plants can be done in all sorts of different ways. We've seen with putting shade netting on and giving support. Also, mulching is a really important thing. Mulching helps to conserve moisture in the soil. It helps to feed the plants if it's using organic mulch such as wood chip or compost. It stops weeds from coming up, and it also protects the plant from plant roots from harsh temperatures, whether in the summer that's a hot sun, or in the winter from cold frosts. And these are the other forms of protection. So the first one might be as simple as putting in a hedge, or you could use one of these tree planting tubes. So when a plant is first being planted, it's planted in that tube. What happens is that's like a little almost polytunnel that it's put inside, and some of these are so clever that these tubes, when they break down, they've got fertilizer impregnated in them, and then as the sunlight breaks them down, it feeds the plant. And the plant doesn't need this after a couple of years. And then if you've got in a city centre, you've planted a tree, you don't want vandals to get it, you don't want cars to hit it, or if you're in an area where you've got cattle or deer and you don't want them to be eating the bark off the young tree, then it's using these guards to stop animals or people or cars bumping in and damaging the bark. You can see how a hedge works as a shelter here, how it reduces the wind considerably. A brick wall increases that, it makes it worse, but a hedge can actually really shelter a garden from the wind. It filters the wind, it slows it down, and it can also protect from really cold temperatures. It can provide shade as well, or it can increase the temperatures depending on where it's being planted and positioned. Cloches are really great temporal things. You see this a lot on vegetable plots. It's like a little mini greenhouse that you can put over, and obviously whether you use glass or plastic or polythene, it can create a much higher difference in temperature because you get a greenhouse effect. That's where the sunlight passes through the glass or the polythene or the plastic, clear plastic, and builds up heat inside. And also spacing, how you space out plants. Planting stuff close together can stop the weeds from coming up. Or if you need more space, particularly with perennials, lifting them and dividing to correctly space them out. And spacing can be done through pruning as well, by pruning back plants so that there's enough space for every plant to grow. Then we have looking at dead and living growth, looking at the difference between it. And the key is just scratching below the surface. This is particularly on woody growth. So we can see under the dead growth that's there, just below the surface it's brown, whereas on living growth just below the surface it's nice and green. Trees covered in a sleeve of green life where the sap moves through. This stuff that's in the middle is structural, non-living growth. The stuff on the outside is the green growth where all the sap's going. It's just below the bark. If that's green, it's living. And then the next one is growth regulators. This kind of thing's going out a bit because a lot of them have been banned by the EU, so check whether these have been banned. This presentation may now be out of date. But growth regulators are like a hormone that you spray onto the foliage of the plant, and it keeps them nice and short and bushy. But the issue with it is that some of them hormones they're not very nice hormones. You used to be able to get one that you could spray on a hedge so that you only ever had to cut the hedge like once a year. It regulated the growth. But what's coming in more now is they're finding that there's more organic techniques, and it might be something as simple as a vibrating bed, or that they put plants on, particularly plants that are containerized, or just running a piece of netting over the plants that simulates winds. And plants don't grow tall in the wind, they grow short and bushy and stocky. So this is in a commercial setting you'll see this type of thing, particularly with plants that are being grown in containers, and plants such as bedding plants or seasonal plants that can end up drawing up if they've been grown in a greenhouse out of season. Because what tends to happen if you're growing something like a bedding plant in spring, it's growing beyond its normal time if it was outdoors, but indoors. And if you get dull days but quite mild temperatures, the plants tend to draw up for light in the darker conditions, but it's nice and warm for them, so they think they should be growing, so they become leggy and not very saleable. So this is where you see a lot of growth regulators. So that's another maintenance procedure, probably one that you probably won't come across in your normal situation, but you'd see this in a commercial nursery. So that's it for unwanted plant growth and maintain its development. A lot of information there. Obviously the key now is to have a go at some of these techniques and keep building on your practical skills for becoming a really good gardener or grower.